If God is perfect, if God is self-sufficient, then what does he need with humanity? Why would he create us at all? Let's watch Tim Barnett rationalize his way out of yet another impossible question for Christianity to answer. These stands to reason videos are getting harder and harder not to be mad at because they're getting dumber and dumber as time goes on. There are some very obvious problems with their theology that people like Tim Barnett are entirely blind to. On purpose, I think. Because you can't pretend to be an intellectual, as Stands Against Reason does, and not see the glaring flaws in your beliefs. Anyhow, this time, Tim wants to explain that God, the all-perfect being that needs nothing at all, somehow wants you to kiss his ass. Because those things don't go together at all. But what can you expect from the religious?
If God requires atonement, then doesn't that mean that he needs something? And if he needs something, doesn't that mean he lacks something? And if he lacks something, how can he be God?
All good questions that I'm sure you won't have any good answers for. Because you never have any good answers for anything. You just have bald assertions and ad hoc rationalizations to explain away good questions for people who aren't that bright to begin with. But sure, go ahead, tell us why a perfect God needs humanity at all.
When Christians talk about God, they mean something very specific. They're referring to a being with essential attributes, and one of these attributes is divine aseity. Now, this means that God is self-existent. He is not dependent on anything else. Therefore, there could be no lack or need in God.
That might be what they say, but it really isn't what they mean. If God doesn't need anything, then God really shouldn't want anything, because wanting something is a sign of insufficiency. If you already have everything, and God is supposed to be everything, then there is no rational basis for having any desires of any kind. You're supposed to already have it all.
Now, underlying this challenge is an equivocation on the word require. The question treats the word require and the word need as if they mean the same thing. In the context, the word require implies a demand, when the word need implies a dependency.
Now he goes into the rationalization rodeo. So let's look at what he's saying. The dictionary defines require as need for a particular purpose. And of course, need is to require something because it's essential or very important. So the dictionary seems to think that the two words are the same thing. In fact, need and require are listed as synonyms for each other. So Tim is trying to define a difference where one really doesn't exist.
Here's a question to help flesh out the distinction. We could ask, if a tenured professor required a passing grade, does he lack something? Well, of course, the answer is no.
No, the answer is yes. Because in order to continue getting paid, the professor, tenured or not, has to pass students. If 100% of every student in the class fails every single time, I don't care about his tenure. The university would have to either get rid of him or get him out of the classroom because he's not doing his job. But the distinction is one he's just ignoring. The professor isn't supposed to be perfect. God is. The professor has a reason to do things the way that he does. God really doesn't. Because God could just poof everything into whatever way he wants it and just be done with it. There is no rational reason why he wouldn't do that if he could. The fact that he doesn't, at least in Christian mythology, says that either God can't, or that God needs or wants something that he cannot achieve by simply making it that way. But they can't justify that, can they?
A teacher demands a passing grade, but doesn't need or depend on a passing grade. It's the student who needs or depends on the passing grade.
Both do. It's a reciprocal relationship. A teacher that can't adequately teach won't be paid to continue teaching. They'll find someone else. They never would have become tenured to begin with if they can't do the job.
Well, likewise, God demands an atonement, but doesn't need or depend on an atonement.
Then why does God want an atonement? And if God gets anything out of it, anything at all, that means God isn't self-sufficient and therefore isn't perfect. What does God need with a starship? What does God need with humanity? This isn't an explanation, it's a rationalization.
It's sinners who need an atonement.
Only because God is a dick. God shouldn't desire worship. Why would God care? Half of the 10 Commandments are about God being needy, about God wanting admiration and ass-kissing. Why would a self-sufficient being care what some unimportant species does? Come on, Tim, explain.
So when Christians talk about God requiring an atonement, they're talking about a demand, not a dependency.
But why is it a demand? Why is it even a thing? If you're totally self-sufficient, and I know I keep going back to this, but it's important, why would God create the universe in the first place? What does he hope to get out of it, considering he needs nothing but himself by definition? That's what doesn't make sense. God should have been perfectly happy sitting wherever he was before he created anything, and that should have been the end of it. It should have been an eternal status quo. God was in a state of absolute perfection, but if you're perfect, why make any changes at all? You can't make it any more perfect. You can only make it less perfect. Why would a perfect being want that? Why would a perfect being want anything at all? These are questions Tim has no answers for.
Because God is perfectly just, he demands atonement for sin. We are all guilty of breaking God's law and rightfully deserve to be punished.
Yet God should have known before he even started that we couldn't uphold his lofty principles. And he did it anyway, which means God screwed up and therefore isn't perfect, or God is a dick and therefore isn't perfect. You really have no intellectual out.
But because of God's perfect goodness and love, he graciously offers an atonement for sin through his Son.
Through his what?
And through his Son, and through his Son, and through his Son, and through his Son.
But if God really cared, then he would have either created beings that were capable of doing what he wanted, or he would have given us standards that we could follow so we wouldn't need atonement. Again, God screwed up, or God is a dick. Pick one.
He didn't need to save anyone.
So God, the perfect, self-sufficient deity, purposely created an imbalance so that insignificant creatures would have to bow down and kiss his ass. Scientists are nowhere remotely close to perfect, but they don't sit in a lab creating experiments designed to worship them. They're not that shallow. What the hell is wrong with this God of yours?
Therefore, it is not as if God needs something, but rather God is owed something. He is owed a payment for sin.
Why would we owe him a payment for something he created in the first place? For something he screwed up in the first place? He could have easily made us perfect. He didn't. He fucked us all, and now he wants worship for it. Never mind what is wrong with your God. What's wrong with you, Tim, for believing this?
So the lack isn't in God, the lack is in us. We lack the ability to pay what is owed. But thanks be to God, what God requires, Christ provides.
Except, as I've said before, Jesus didn't actually forgive any sins if there are still sins, if we have to keep asking for forgiveness. Yet another place that this supposedly perfect imaginary friend of yours screwed up completely. And this is exactly why Stands Against Reason doesn't want to talk to atheists, because we recognize the absurdity of what they're saying, and we're not going to keep our mouths shut. The religious, well, they're not so bright, and they've been trained to sit down, shut up, and don't think about what's being spewed from the pulpit. Atheists don't do that. When we hear something stupid, we point out that it's stupid. And Tim, all of this is stupid. Every single thing you've said in this entire video. But you don't want to think about it because that gets in the way of your emotionally comforting narrative. The whole concept of your God is moronic. This supposedly perfect being that doesn't need anything creates a universe with the express purpose of getting its ass kissed. It creates flawed human beings that it knows full well cannot meet its expectations, then damns those flawed human beings to eternal torture unless they bow down and worship it. But this God doesn't need anything, does it? It's just a psychology experiment in cruelty. Your God is a fucking dick, and so are you, Tim, for believing any of this and for trying to push it on others. And you're not bright enough to see what you're doing and the absurdity of what you believe. No wonder you hide in your religious safe space, because you're hardly human. What does God need with you?